If you've ever wanted to get a good, solid understanding of the history of Assyria in a relatively short series of videos, this is probably it. No, really, I tried my best to put about 10 to 1100 years of Assyrian history into a few hours. Honestly, it's a super interesting topic, so without further ado, let's begin. For starters, Assyria was a people, culture, kingdom, and eventually an empire which became one of the most formidable states in the ancient world during the 2nd and 1st millennium BCE. Though it went through several periods of expansion and contraction, at its height, the empire of the Assyrians was possibly the largest and most powerful that the world had ever seen up until that time. Based in the highlands of Mesopotamia in what is today part of Iraqi Kurdistan, the empire stretched from the mountains of Asia Minor down to the Persian Gulf, and from Egypt on one side to modern-day Iran on the other. Its center of power were the cities of Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, all located in the Assyrian heartland, but it also held sway for generations over the wealthy and fabled cities of Babylon, Uruk, Mari, Susa, and many of the other great cities of the time. When you think about it, it's pretty remarkable. These cities were the Londons, New Yorks, Tokyos, and Shanghais of the ancient world, and they were all ruled by the Assyrian king in northern Mesopotamia. Both their military and commercial acumen were unmatched by any other people of the ancient Near East. It's safe to say that the Assyrians were more than a force to be reckoned with. They were the epitome of what most civilizations of the time aspired to be. Of course, this power came at a price, especially for their enemies. The Assyrians had a well-deserved reputation for being ruthless conquerors who had no compunction about massacring entire populations. Pretty much today what we'd call a genocide. We know about this not only from the inscriptions and bas reliefs that they themselves left behind, but also from the words of others. These include the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, as well as records kept by Babylonian and Elamite scribes. Even Herodotus, who was a Greek, writes about them in his monumental work, The Histories, and when he does, it's not about their magnanimity. In terms of their history, Assyriologists, or those who study Assyria and ancient Mesopotamia, have divided it up into three main periods, the first of which is the Old Assyrian, the second the Middle Assyrian, and the third being the Neo-Assyrian period. This latter period and the empire that was established during it is considered to be the greatest of those founded in Mesopotamia due to its expanse and highly developed and efficient military. Overall, the Assyrians were highly effective in everything that they did. So let's take a look at the early period of Assyrian history. While there are quite a few legends that scholars have uncovered with regard to the origins of the Assyrian state and its people, we're going to focus on the more historical ones. The history of Assyria really starts with the founding of the city of Ashur, sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE. However, Assyria has a somewhat, you could say, legendary history before that. Now, I'm using the term legendary because other than the names of a few rulers or kings that are written on a document known as the Assyrian King List, which we'll get to in a few minutes, we really have no evidence or mention of Assyria as a people or a state before the 3rd millennium BCE. Actually, to be honest, the only real concrete evidence we have of the Assyrians themselves comes from the reign of King Shamshi-Adad I, who ruled from the years 1809 until 1776 BCE. Even he himself, though, is not believed to have been of Assyrian origin, but rather an Amorite. Because of a lack of sources, very little is known about Assyria in the 3rd millennium BCE. What we do know is that Assyria was part of the Akkadian Empire of Sargon the Great and his sons, as well as of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. This can be seen by mention of Subartu, the term for Assyria, in the texts from both dynasties. Another, more prolific source are the many thousands of cuneiform tablets containing information about Assyrian trade colonies in what is today the Cappadocia region of Turkey. These documents, especially those from the ancient city of Kanesh, contained a wealth of information about Assyrian life and economic activity. Kanesh was among the most lucrative Assyrian trading posts. Merchants from Ashur traveled there to set up precious metals and textile trading businesses and brought the profits back to Ashur. Speaking of Ashur, we need to take a closer look at this city and what it really meant to both Assyrian identity and their empire. To the Assyrians, it was not just any city, it was the city. Think of it as what Rome was to the Roman Empire. Sure, there can be many cities within an empire, but only one Rome. Capitals may change, as occasionally happened when barbarians invaded and sacked Rome, or when it was officially moved to Byzantium, aka Constantinople. However, the importance of Rome to the identity of the Romans never changed. Even today, the Tuscan countryside may be the most beautiful part of Italy, Florence its cultural and intellectual heart, and Milan its center of industry. But Rome will always be the capital of Italy and a symbol of the greatness of Italian civilization. Well, at least this is how an Italian friend described it to me. The same could be said, though, of Ashur and its importance to the Assyrians throughout their ancient history. Due to such scant archaeological and written evidence from the time, we know very little about Ashur and what life was like there for the early Assyrians. For all practical purposes, Ashur was probably little more than a medium-sized city-state or kingdom along the shores of the western bank of the Tigris River. A holy place, perhaps, but not one of great importance to the peoples of the ancient world, with the exception, of course, of the Assyrians. Like any city, it had its own rulers, in this case a group of minor kings or tribal chieftains. The list of these rulers comes from a document known to us as the Assyrian King List. So, what is the Assyrian King List? Well, it's as the name implies, a list of the kings of ancient Assyria, starting around 2500 BCE and in some cases going up to the 8th century BCE. I say in some cases up to the 8th century BCE because several lists from various eras have been found, the most recent of which being updated in the 8th century, before the Common Era. For the most part, though, all of the king lists have been found to have matching names in the same order. Thus, they're pretty much more or less consistent with each other. Written on cuneiform tablets and discovered in the ruins of ancient Assyrian cities such as Ashur, Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh, the king list is the best chronology that we have of both the early rulers of ancient Assyria and Greater Mesopotamia. However, consistencies between lists do not mean that they are accurate. Many of the lists contain the names of kings, especially early ones, for which there is no other historical reference or evidence. Another interesting thing is that other kings for which there is ample historical evidence are not included within the list. Thus, like anything in archaeology or ancient history, one has to take such documents with not a grain, but a pound of salt. In fact, many Assyriologists believe that the list was originally created to link the king Shamshi-Adad I, who was believed to have been of Amorite origin, to the native rulers of the land of Assyria. Over time, scribes would add future kings to this list, basically compiling it into the version of the document that we have discovered today. The Assyrian king list is divided into several sections. The first is a group of 17 individuals who are known as kings who lived in tents. This suggests that they were perhaps not kings in the sense that we know the word, but more like nomadic chieftains who ruled over what may have been some sort of tribal confederation. The first king was named Tudia. We know nothing about this king except for his name. The same is more or less true for the next 16 kings. What is interesting, though, is that the first 10 of these kings are the same as the ancestors listed by the great Babylonian king Hammurabi, who is definitely known to have been of Amorite origin, the same as Shamshi-Adad I. Now, the last two kings who lived in tents are a little special. Up until their time, it seems that the ancient Assyrians didn't have an actual city of their own until about 2050 BCE, when their 16th king, Ushpia, founded and dedicated a city to Ashur, the head of the Assyrian pantheon. This city was named after the god, and it has been known as Ashur ever since. Despite having laid the foundation to this new settlement, Ushpia seems to have preferred his nomadic way of life and didn't actually set up formal court in Ashur. That would be a new tradition that his son and successor, Apiashal, would start. According to the king list, Apiashal's name was the last of those, quote, who lived in tents, end of quote. But he's also the first to appear on the next portion of the list, known as kings who are ancestors, or whose fathers are known. There are 10 such kings in this portion of the list. Now, what exactly the term kings who are ancestors or whose fathers are known actually is a bit of a mystery. However, one can speculate that these were less legendary rulers, at least to the Assyrians, and more historical ones for whom some sort of record existed. After this is a list of 6 other kings who are believed to have been the early rulers of the city of Ashur. The fourth of these, Puzur-Ashur I, perhaps started a new native Assyrian dynasty in Ashur. His name, Puzur-Ashur, means servant of Ashur, and it's a very Assyrian name. One could almost say a nationalist type of name. This implies that Ashur was independent of any other peoples or empires of Mesopotamia or Anatolia at the time. One of the more famous kings of this line was Irishum I, who is credited with either building or restoring the temple of Ashur. There are some scholars who even believe that it was he and not Ipiashal, mentioned earlier, who laid the first foundations of both the city and temple of Ashur. While these kings seem to have been very proud to have been Assyrian, later rulers often identified with the great kings of old. For example, Sargon I of Assyria and Naram-Sin of Assyria are 2 rulers who probably identified with the great Akkadian kings of the same names from over half a millennium before. These Akkadian kings were larger than life and the supermen of their day. Now, of course, this is understandable. I mean, who doesn't want to identify with some beloved and highly respected godlike personage from history? However, it should be noted that the Assyrian Sargon and Naram-Sin ruled a fraction of the territory that their Akkadian counterparts did. The Assyrian Sargon ruled over the city-state of Ashur, while his Akkadian counterpart ruled over the largest empire of his time. In fact, up until this point, most Assyrian kings had little real power outside of Ashur and maybe a few nearby villages. Based on the records of the Akkadians and later the Sumerians of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, it is likely that the Assyrians acted as vassals of these 2 aforementioned empires during various periods of their early history. To outsiders, this land was called Subartu, and Ashur was merely an insignificant city-state within it. We can kind of think of Subartu as a borderland in between the wealthy kingdoms and empires of Mesopotamia in the south and those of the Hurrians and Hittites of Anatolia to the north. Ashur, though, would become part of a much bigger entity after the reign of its 38th king, Irishum II. The Assyrian city-state would be conquered by the likes of an Amorite king, Shamshi-Adad I. From this point on, Assyria's destiny would be altered. Okay, so if you've stuck with me through this program so far, you've heard me mention the name Shamshi-Adad I a few times now. There are not too many big names that come up during early Assyrian history, but he's one of the exceptions, and rightfully so. Shamshi-Adad was a king of Amorite origin who lived around the same time as the great Babylonian king Hammurabi. Now, the historical record makes Shamshi-Adad out to be this very respected and admired person, and probably he was. Though he was not an Assyrian and technically a conqueror of Ashur, the Assyrians themselves seem to have considered him to be one of their own. After all, there were several kings in the future that took the name Shamshi-Adad as their throne name. This was no doubt because they actually wanted to be identified with the original Shamshi-Adad. His early life is shrouded in mystery and also seemingly uneventful. He succeeded his father, Ela-Kabkabum, in the year 1836 BCE and became the ruler of a city-state named Turka in what is today eastern Syria. He later set up shop in a city called Ekalatum, just a few kilometers from Ashur. Now around this time, a king named Naram-Sin of the city-state of Eshnuna attacked and overran the kingdom of Shamshi-Adad. Shamshi-Adad then was exiled to Babylon, which was at the time ruled by fellow Amorites and likely distant relatives of his. As we mentioned before, the first 10 or so ancestors of Shamshi-Adad are listed in the Assyrian king list and are more or less identical to those cited by Hammurabi as his ancestors, showing that the 2 rulers were linked by a common ancestry. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. Anyway, after the death of Naram-Sin in 1811 BCE, Shamshi-Adad returned to Ekalatum. He stayed there for 3 years before conquering Ashur and the rest of Assyria. He then began conquering the surrounding areas, including the city of Shubat-Enlil, which eventually became his capital. This also gave him control of important trade routes that linked Mesopotamia to both Anatolia and Syria. His actions, though, didn't go unnoticed by his neighbors. In fact, the king of Mari, Yakdun-Lim, also took an interest in the region and considered Shamsi-Adad's incursions close to his kingdom as a great threat. After all, Mari had grown extremely wealthy from such trade, and Yakdun-Lim wasn't planning to share his potential profits with anyone. The two kings went to war with each other for several years, but eventually Yakdun-Lim was defeated and later assassinated. In 1796 BCE, Shamsi-Adad captured Mari and ousted Yakdun-Lim's successor, Sumu-Yaman. From then on and until the end of his reign, Shamsi-Adad remained in the city of Shubat-Enlil. After his death in 1776 BCE, one of his sons, Ishme-Dagan, became ruler over most of his empire. Unfortunately, the son was not as capable a ruler as his father, and with the exception of Akhenaten and the primary Assyrian cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and Erbil, Ishme-Dagan lost most of the empire that Shamsi-Adad had won. For the next 300 years, the historical record of Assyria is mostly silent. There are currently few records from both Assyrian sources as well as those of their neighbors that detail the current happenings of those years with any sort of certainty. Actually, all we have are the names of the various kings who ruled Ashur from the Assyrian king list. The fact that the unbroken list of names is more or less of Assyrian origin seems to indicate that at least Ashur was governed by native rulers. Still, the fact that there is little to no mention of Assyria or Subartu indicates that the authority of these kings probably didn't extend too far outside the city's defensive walls. If it did in any significant way, we'd surely have heard about it from both the Assyrians themselves as well as from the archives of their more powerful neighbors. Whatever was going on during that time, we do know that by the 15th century, the Hurrian king of the Mitanni, Shaustatar, invaded Assyria and annexed Ashur into his realm. Records indicate that he looted the city and then forced its rulers, as well as those of Nineveh, Erbil, and Kirkuk, to become his vassals. The Mitanni ruled over Assyria for at least several generations, but by the 14th century BCE, their power seems to have waned, with the Assyrians once again asserting their independence. There are actually several pieces of evidence to support this. I'm actually going to quote the great Assyriologist H.W.F. Saggs, for he can explain it much better than I can. In his book, The Might That Was Assyria, Saggs writes that, and I quote, "By the very end of the 15th century, we have indications of the beginning of Assyrian revival. There was rebuilding of the walls of Ashur, significant since an ancient Near Eastern capital with strong walls was potentially independent, and a boundary treaty was made between Assyria and Babylonia. By about 1400 BCE, a king of Assyria was sufficiently his own man to correspond with the king of Egypt and to merit a present of 20 talents of gold, a fact mentioned by his successor, Ashur-uballit I. A Mitannian king tells us of the circumstances, though not the precise year, in which Assyria finally and decisively threw off Mitanni control. The information comes from a treaty between the Mitanni and the Hittites. Basic to the situation was the existence alongside Mitanni of a second Hurrian kingdom, known as Hurri, with rivalry between the two dynastically related rulers. When border friction developed between Mitanni and the Hittites, the pro-Hittite stance of Hurri allowed the Hittites to invade Mitanni. Crisis ensued in Mitanni. The Assyrians and another kingdom, Alshi, took advantage of the situation to seize Mitannian territory. The Assyrian king concerned is not named, but the chronology makes it likely that it was Ashur-uballit's father, Eriba-Adad. End of quote. Now that's a mouthful, but I think you get the idea. Assyria was well on its way to becoming a regional power, something that was made even more clear when Ashur-uballit was able to directly influence the succession of the king of Babylonia, a state that was often a rival of Assyria. It's from here onward that Assyria starts its transformation from a small kingdom into that of an empire. This will be the subject of the next episode. Stay tuned as we learn about the expansion of the Assyrian state and its development into a mighty empire. Thanks everyone for checking out the program. Part 2 of the series is coming up, along with many other videos on history and basically any other topics that I like. So if you're interested in hearing more, please hit that subscribe button. Thanks for stopping by, and see you soon.